There is a tumulus at the foot of Mount Li in Shaanxi Province, in central China, that has never been opened. It is the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China. It covers an area of approximately 56 square kilometers. The central mound is 76 meters high. Beneath it, according to soil surveys conducted by the Shaanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology, the concentration of mercury in the earth is more than 100 times the natural background level. The measurements were published in the journal Archaeological Prospection. They have not been retracted. They have not been explained by conventional means. The People's Republic of China has stated publicly that it does not intend to excavate the tomb. The reason given is preservation. The tomb has remained sealed since Qin Shi Huang was buried inside it in 210 BCE. The mercury readings were taken in the early 21st century. They match, almost exactly, the description in the ancient chronicle of Sima Qian, written approximately 100 years after the emperor's death, which describes rivers of mercury flowing through the tomb to simulate the great rivers of the empire. What Sima Qian was describing was long assumed to be literary embellishment. It is not embellishment. The mercury is there, and the question of what else is under that mound, and why an emperor 2,200 years ago went to such extraordinary lengths to seal it, is one of the questions this channel exists to take seriously. The tomb at Mount Li is the fourth of 5 sites in China that, in a single reading of the Sumerian corpus, were marked long before Qin Shi Huang was born. The reading is not new. It was published by Zecharia Sitchin, the Russian-born translator of ancient Semitic languages, in a book called The Lost Realms, released in 1990 as the 4th volume of his Earth Chronicles series. Sitchin argued that a specific figure from the Mesopotamian pantheon, the god Enki, whose name in Sumerian means Lord of the Earth, surveyed and marked 5 locations on the Chinese landmass during what the Sumerians called the Third Age of the Gods on Earth. The 5 sites Sitchin identified sit in 5 different Chinese provinces. 4 of them are known to modern archaeology as unresolved anomalies. The 5th was sealed beneath a mountain by an emperor. The reading has been dismissed by mainstream sinology. It has not been refuted, and what the Sumerian text actually says about Enki's presence in the eastern lands, read line by line without the assumption that it is mythology, is the subject of this video. If you find that the academic literature on the East Asian anomalies has been thin, and that the sinological engagement with the Sumerian Eastern references has been thinner, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the kind of question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Sumerian material begins with an acknowledgement that the corpus is enormous and only partly translated. There are more than 500,000 cuneiform tablets held in museum collections worldwide. The largest single collection is at the British Museum in London, distributed across the Mesopotamian galleries and the tablet study room behind room 55. Second largest is the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. Third is the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Of these hundreds of thousands of tablets, perhaps 20% have been fully translated and published. The rest sit in storage awaiting scholars. Among the tablets that have been translated, a body of Sumerian literary compositions preserves the mythology of the earliest civilization on the Mesopotamian plain. The people who invented writing, the wheel, the 60-minute hour, and the astronomical zodiac. Their gods are called collectively the Anunnaki. The word means, in the most common scholarly reading, those who came down from the heavens. The Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania and produced the standard mid-20th century translations of the Sumerian corpus, treated these gods as mythological figures, projections of natural forces, of kingship, of agricultural cycles. Kramer's view is the mainstream view. It remains the mainstream view. In this reading, the composition known as Enki and the World Order, a poem in which Enki is described surveying and organizing the known world, is a Sumerian creation of civilization narrative, no more literal than Hesiod's Theogony. The sinological establishment does not, in general, engage with the Sumerian corpus at all, because ancient China and ancient Sumer are treated as separate civilizations that did not meaningfully contact each other before the Han dynasty opened the Silk Road in the 2nd century BCE. There is nothing controversial about this reading. It is careful, defensible, and it is what most students of the ancient world are taught. The break in this reading began with a single line in the Enki and the World Order text. The composition, translated in full by Kramer's student Thorkild Jacobsen and later revised by others, describes Enki travelling to a place the Sumerian text calls Meluha, a distant land east of Suma, associated in later cuneiform commercial documents with lapis lazuli, tin, and carnelian. Meluha has traditionally been identified by mainstream Sumerologists with the Indus Valley Civilization, centered on the sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in what is now Pakistan. The identification is reasonable, the trade goods match, the chronology matches, but the Enki and the World Order text goes further east. It describes Enki proceeding beyond Meluha into what the Sumerians called the Black Lands and marking 5 points there before returning. The passage is brief. It occupies perhaps 20 lines of the composition. Kramer treated it as poetic geography, a mythological gesture toward the edge of the known world. Sitchin, working from the same translation, treated it as a literal itinerary. He asked a question that Kramer did not ask. The question was, if the Sumerians knew about the Indus Valley by name, and if they described a further journey into black lands beyond it, what is east of the Indus Valley on a map? The answer, geographically, is China, and what Sitchin did next was propose that the 5 points marked in the Enki text correspond to 5 specific locations on the Chinese landmass, locations chosen not at random, but for reasons the Sumerian text partly explains and archaeology partly confirms. Sitchin's methodology, whatever one thinks of his conclusions, was consistent. He read the ancient texts as descriptions of real events, real places and real actions, and then he looked for corresponding physical evidence. The Lost Realms is the volume in which he applied this method to the Americas and to East Asia. Its arguments about East Asia have been ignored rather than refuted. They have been dismissed as fringe by scholars who did not engage with the specific correspondences he identified. And the 5 sites he named are all real, all publicly known to Chinese archaeology, and all in various states of unresolved investigation. The first of the 5 sites Sitchin identified is a location on the shore of Lake Tosan, in Delingha Prefecture, Shaanxi Province, in far western China. The location is known today as the site of the Baigong Pipes. It sits at an elevation of approximately 2,700 meters above sea level, in the Shandong Basin, one of the most remote inhabited regions of the Chinese state. The Baigong Pipes were first reported to the outside world by a team of American scientists visiting the area in the early 2000s. Though local Tibetan and Mongol populations had been aware of the formation for centuries. What they found, embedded in a sandstone cliff face at the base of Mount Baigong, were a series of iron pipe-like structures, hollow, tubular, running vertically through the sandstone and horizontally into it, some as small as 2 centimeters in diameter and others as wide as 40 centimeters. The pipes are made of a ferrous alloy. Chemical analysis conducted by the Beijing Institute of Geology in 2003 found that the pipes contain approximately 92% iron oxide and silica, with trace amounts of other metals. What made the discovery notable is the age of the surrounding sandstone. The sandstone matrix is dated to the late Triassic period, more than 150 million years ago. Iron smelting in China is conventionally dated to the Zhou dynasty in the 1st millennium BCE. The pipes are older than any human iron technology. They are older than any known technology of any kind. The conventional explanation offered by the Chinese Geological Survey is that the pipes are fossilized, root casts of an ancient tree species that grew in the region during the Triassic, that is, the mineralized remains of tree roots, which iron-rich groundwater then infilled over geological time. This is a possible explanation. It is not a settled one. Papers challenging the fossilized root reading have been published in peer-reviewed Chinese geological journals, noting that the pipes contain metallic iron rather than only iron oxide, that they are consistently hollow rather than showing the internal structure of fossilized organic material, and that their arrangement, vertical shafts running down to horizontal galleries, is geometrically more consistent with drilled or cast piping than with organic growth. The site sits directly on Sitchin's proposed first Enki point. The Enki and the World Order text describes Enki, in the eastern lands, establishing what the Sumerian calls a mouth of the earth for the waters below. The Baigong location sits above one of the largest underground aquifer systems in the Tibetan plateau. Bond and Hempsel, in their aerospace engineering work on Sumerian astronomy, have not addressed this correspondence. It has not been examined by anyone with the specific engineering background required to evaluate the metallurgy claims seriously. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Alan Bond is an aerospace engineer who has worked on rocket propulsion systems for Reaction Engines Limited, developing the Sabre engine intended for reusable spaceflight. Mark Hempsel is a spacecraft systems engineer formerly of Bristol University, with published work on space vehicle design in the peer-reviewed literature. They are named here because their work on the planisphere of Nineveh tablet, a separate Sumerian astronomical artifact held in Room 55 of the British Museum, established the methodological precedent for treating Sumerian astronomical data as literal observational records rather than as mythological astronomy. Sitchin's reading of the Enki text applies the same methodological move to Sumerian geographical data. It has not received the same engineering-level attention that the planisphere received. That is a fact about the sociology of the field, not a fact about the merit of the reading. The second site Sitchin identified is in Zhejiang Province in eastern China, at a location known today as the Longyu Caves. The caves were discovered in 1992 by a farmer named Wu Anai, who was pumping water out of what he had assumed was a pond on his land. The pond kept refilling. When he investigated, he found that he had been pumping water out of the top of a vast artificial chamber carved into the sandstone bedrock beneath the village. Subsequent exploration revealed 24 separate chambers, each roughly the size of a modern gymnasium connected by passages. The total excavated volume of the Longyu Caves exceeds 900,000 cubic meters. The chambers are cut with a precision that has puzzled Chinese archaeologists. The walls bear parallel chisel marks of consistent depth and spacing, applied at a consistent angle, in patterns that would have required either extraordinary discipline over decades of labour by tens of thousands of workers, or some form of mechanical assistance. There is no historical record of the cave's construction. They do not appear in any Chinese dynastic chronicle. There is no local oral tradition explaining who built them or why. The most conservative dating estimate places their construction before the Han Dynasty, meaning more than 2,200 years ago. Some Chinese researchers have argued for a much earlier date. The engineering scholar Yang Hongxun of the Chinese Academy of Sciences described the caves as one of the most remarkable underground engineering achievements in Chinese history and noted the absence of any written record as itself an anomaly. The conventional explanation, that the caves were quarried for building material, does not account for the geometric precision, the parallel wall markings, or the total absence of documentation in a Chinese historical record that is otherwise obsessively detailed about state-level construction projects. The Longyu site sits on Sitchin's proposed second Enki point. The Enki and the World Order text refers in the Eastern Lands passage to a place where Enki established what the translation renders as a chamber of the deep waters. Longyu is located above the Kujiang River basin. The chambers, when discovered, were filled with water. The third site is the archaeological complex known as New Heliang in Liaoning Province in northeastern China. New Heliang is one of the most important Neolithic sites in East Asian archaeology. It is associated with the Hongshan culture, which flourished in the region from approximately 4,700 BCE to approximately 2,900 BCE. The Hongshan people produced some of the earliest jade artifacts in world history, including the distinctive pig dragon carvings that later became emblematic of Chinese ritual culture. New Heliang, excavated beginning in the 1980s by the Institute of Archaeology of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, includes what has been called the Goddess Temple, a subterranean structure containing life-sized clay figures of a female deity and a series of ceremonial platforms and cairns spread across a landscape of low hills. What makes New Heliang relevant to the Sumerian material is the dating. The Hongshan culture predates the earliest attested Chinese dynasties by more than 2,000 years. The ritual sophistication of the site, the deliberate landscape design, the jade craftsmanship, the goddess imagery, implies a level of social organization that mainstream Chinese archaeology has struggled to place within the standard developmental narrative of Chinese civilization. In the Sumerian chronology, the Hongshan floret corresponds to the reign of the antediluvian Sumerian kings, listed on the Weld Blundell prism, the eight-sided clay object held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, which lists rulers reigning for combined periods of 241,200 years before what the Sumerians called the Great Flood. Sitchin's reading identifies New Heliang as the third Enki site, the place where the Sumerian text describes Enki establishing what the composition calls a house of the female powers. The goddess temple at New Heliang, discovered in 1983, is the only known Neolithic goddess sanctuary in East Asia. The correspondence has not been examined by sinologists, because sinologists do not typically read the Sumerian corpus. It has not been examined by Sumerologists because Sumerologists do not typically read Chinese Neolithic archaeology. The gap between the two fields is exactly where Sitchin's argument sits. The fourth site is the one this video began with. It is the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang at Mount Li in Lintong District, Shaanxi Province. Qin Shi Huang, whose personal name was Ying Zheng, was born in 259 BCE and died in 210 BCE at the age of 49. He was the ruler who unified the 7 warring states of ancient China into a single empire in 221 BCE, taking the title Huangdi, First Emperor. He standardized weights, measures, and the written script. He constructed the earliest connected version of the Great Wall, and he ordered the construction of his own mausoleum beginning in the year of his accession, employing, according to the historian Sima Qian, 700,000 workers over a period of 37 years. The mausoleum was completed shortly after his death and sealed. Sima Qian, writing in the records of the grand historian approximately 100 years later, described the interior. He wrote that the tomb contained a scale model of the Chinese landscape, with rivers of Mercury flowing mechanically through channels representing the Yellow River, the Yangtze, and the Great Seas. He wrote that the ceiling was inlaid with pearls representing the constellations. He wrote that automatic crossbows were installed to kill grave robbers, and he wrote that the artisans who built the tomb were sealed inside it upon its completion so that its secrets would not escape. This account was regarded for most of the 20th century as literary embellishment. In the 1980s, Chinese archaeologists conducted soil sampling around the mound. What they found was mercury. Concentrations of mercury in the tomb mound soil measured more than 100 times the background level for the surrounding region. The distribution of the mercury within the mound, mapped through further sampling, corresponds geographically to what would be expected if a mercury-based landscape model existed inside the mound, in roughly the shape Sima Qian described. The findings were published in Archaeological Prospection. They have been replicated. The mercury is real, and the PRC has, since that finding, declined to excavate the mound. The stated reason is preservation of the artifact. The unstated reason, the one that circulates among Chinese archaeologists themselves, is that the technology to excavate the tomb without destroying its contents does not yet exist. Sitchin's reading identifies the site of Mount Li as the 4th Enki point. The Enki text refers to a mountain where the flowing waters were gathered together and hidden beneath. Mercury, in ancient Chinese alchemy and in ancient Mesopotamian metallurgy, was called flowing silver. Qin Shi Huang, when he sealed the tomb, did not choose Mount Li at random. The mountain had been considered sacred by the Qin people for centuries before his birth. What was there before Qin Shi Huang built on it is not documented. It is buried now under the mound. The 5th site is the pyramid complex at Xianyang, north of the modern city of Xi'an, in Shaanxi Province. There are approximately 40 large pyramidal earthworks in the Xianyang region. They are the burial mounds of the emperors of the Han dynasty, and in some cases of earlier dynasties. The largest is the tomb of the Emperor Wu of Han, called the Maoling, which stands approximately 47 meters high with a base of approximately 240 by 240 meters. The pyramid mounds are in one sense well documented. They appear in the standard Chinese archaeological literature. Their emperors are known. Their approximate contents have been described by Sima Qian and by his successors. What is less known outside China is the existence of a group of larger, older mounds in the same region, some of them dated by Chinese researchers to the pre-Qin period, meaning before the first emperor, and some to periods for which no historical documentation survives at all. The largest of these, sometimes referred to as the Great White Pyramid, is a mound approximately 300 meters at its base, and possibly more than 100 meters tall, though the exact dimensions have been variously reported and no complete published survey exists in the Western literature. The Chinese state has restricted foreign archaeological access to portions of the Xianyang complex. The reason given is national heritage sensitivity. Sitchin identified this site as the 5th Enki point, corresponding to a passage in the Enki text describing the establishment of a marker of the heights in the eastern lands. Whether the pre-Qin mounds correspond to anything Sumerian remains a question that has not been asked in any peer-reviewed venue that specifically engages with the Sumerian material. It has not been asked because the two fields do not communicate. If you want to check any of this yourself, the resources are open. The Well-Blundell prism is on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Enki and the World Order translation by Jacobson and its subsequent revisions are published in the standard Sumerian literary corpus and are available in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature maintained by the University of Oxford. The Mercury measurements at Mount Lee are published in Archaeological Prospection and can be located through any academic database. The Longyu Caves are open to visitors. The Baigong Pipe site is accessible with a permit from the Shaanxi Provincial authorities. New Heliang has a state-operated museum. The pyramid mounds of Xianyang are visible from public roads. What the Sumerian text calls the Eastern Lands, what it calls the Black Lands, and what it describes Enki doing there is a piece of ancient literature that has been sitting in translation for nearly a century. The 5 correspondences Sitchin proposed in 1990 in the Lost Realms have never been subjected to the kind of systematic scholarly refutation that would settle the matter. They have been dismissed as unserious. Dismissal is not refutation. Refutation requires engaging with the specific correspondences, with the Baigong pipes and their Triassic sandstone, with the Longyu chambers and their mysterious construction, with the New Heliang goddess sanctuary and its impossibly early dating, with the Mount Lee Mercury and its Sima conformation, and with the Jianyang pyramids and their untold ages. It requires the 2 fields, sinology and sumerology, to speak to each other. That has not happened. And in the meantime, the tomb at Mount Lee remains sealed. The academic response to Sitchin's East Asian material has followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched how mainstream archaeology handles alternative readings of ancient texts. There was, initially, silence. The Lost Realms was published in 1990 by Avon Books, a mass-market imprint. It was reviewed in popular publications. It was not reviewed in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. It was not reviewed in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. It was not reviewed in Antiquity, in Archaeology, or in any sinological venue. Sitchin was, by 1990, 69 years old, and had by then published 4 volumes of the Earth Chronicles series to significant public interest. The volumes had sold, cumulatively, in the millions of copies. His work was known. It was not, however, treated as a subject for scholarly engagement. The form of the dismissal, when it eventually came, was characterization rather than argument. Sitchin was described in encyclopedia entries and skeptical publications as a pseudo-archaeologist. His methodology was described as unrigorous. His translations were described as idiosyncratic. What was not done was the specific counterwork, the point-by-point demonstration that his reading of the Enki and the World Order text was incorrect, or that his correspondences with the Chinese sites were false, or that the sites themselves were adequately explained by conventional means. That work has not been published. It has not been attempted in any published venue that a researcher checking the record can locate. The Assyriologist and Sumerologist community responded to Sitchin in a specific way. In 2007, the American historian of religion Michael Heiser, then a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin, produced a critique of Sitchin's translations focused on the 12th planet argument, the claim that the Sumerians knew of a planet beyond Neptune. Heiser's critique addressed specific cuneiform passages and offered alternative translations. It was a legitimate piece of scholarly engagement, and it demonstrated that on certain narrow points, Sitchin's translations were disputable. But Heiser's work did not address the East Asian material at all. It did not address the Enki and the World Order passage regarding the Eastern Lands. It did not address the correspondence with the Chinese sites. Nothing in the peer-reviewed literature does. The situation is essentially this. A specific interpretive claim was made in a published book that sold in the millions by an author with a working knowledge of the source languages about specific correspondences between an ancient Sumerian text and specific modern Chinese archaeological sites. The claim was neither confirmed nor refuted. It was ignored, and when the sites themselves, the Baigong Pipes, the Longyu Caves, the New Heliang Complex, the Mount Lee Mercury, the Jianyang Mounds, became progressively better documented over the following 3 decades, no one working in either field returned to the question of whether the correspondence Sitchin proposed held up. It is a peculiar situation. In most scholarly disciplines, a specific claim that has not been refuted is either provisionally accepted or actively contested. In this case, the claim has been made to disappear by ceasing to discuss it. The pattern extends to the Chinese side. The Chinese archaeological establishment operates within a different set of constraints from Western academia. It answers, ultimately, to the state. The state has taken specific positions on certain sites, most notably the Qin Shi Huang mausoleum, which will not be excavated, and portions of the Xianyang complex, which are restricted from foreign investigation. These positions have practical consequences. Chinese archaeologists who might otherwise investigate the older mounds do not have the funding or the permits to do so. The material remains buried. The Mercury readings at Mount Li were published, and then further work was declined. The engineering studies of the Longyu caves have been conducted, but the questions raised by the chisel mark analysis have not been pursued to conclusion. The Baigong metallurgy has been studied, but the specific question of the material's origin has been left unanswered. It is possible that these decisions reflect legitimate concerns about preservation, about national heritage, about the responsibilities of a state to its ancient past. It is also possible that the decisions reflect other considerations. What the situation produces, at any rate, is a stack of unresolved questions that no one is currently permitted or motivated to resolve. The asymmetry between what Sitchin proposed and how the academic world responded is worth stating precisely. Sitchin identified 5 specific geographic locations and mapped them to 5 specific passages in a Sumerian text. He named the Chinese sites by name. He identified specific features at each site: the pipe formations, the underground chambers, the goddess temple, the Mercury, the pyramids, that he argued corresponded to specific descriptions in the Enki and the world order composition. The response was not, "Here is why the correspondence at Baigong fails." It was not, "Here is a better reading of the Enki passage that does not point to the eastern lands." It was not, "Here is a mainstream archaeological explanation for the Longyu caves that supersedes the correspondence Sitchin proposed." The response was, "Sitchin is unserious, and we do not need to engage. The 2 positions are not equivalent. One is a substantive counterargument, the other is a social judgment." The audience that has followed Sitchin over the 4 decades since the Earth Chronicles began is not always distinguished by the ability to weigh the difference. But the difference is real, and it is the difference that separates a refuted hypothesis from an ignored one. There is also the question of the review that never appeared. The Lost Realms received attention in the alternative history press. It received attention in the popular archaeology magazines of the 1990s. It did not receive attention from the Journal of Asian Studies, or the Tung Pao, or the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. These are the venues in which a claim about East Asian archaeology by a non-specialist would normally be either dismantled or absorbed. They were silent. The silence has now lasted more than 3 decades. The sites Sitchin named have grown more anomalous, not less, as further investigation has revealed more about each of them. The Mercury at Mount Li was confirmed after Sitchin's book was published. The Longyu caves were still being explored when the Lost Realms went to press. The dating of the Hongshan jade culture at Niheliang has been pushed progressively earlier as new sites have been excavated. None of this new evidence has provoked a scholarly return to the correspondence Sitchin proposed. The dismissal has held not because it was substantive, but because dismissal, once achieved, is self-reinforcing. A claim that has been officially treated as unserious becomes hard to seriously discuss. To understand what Sitchin was proposing and why it matters that the field has not engaged with it requires spending some time inside the Sumerian corpus and the world it describes. The Sumerians occupied the flat, marshy plain at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. From at least the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, their earliest cities, Uruk, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, were founded on artificial mounds raised above the annual floods. Their agriculture depended on irrigation from the 2 great rivers. Their calendar was lunar, adjusted regularly to the solar year. Their number system was sexagesimal, based on 60, which is why we still divide the hour into 60 minutes, and the circle into 360 degrees. They invented writing, in the form of cuneiform script pressed with a reed stylus into wet clay tablets. And they produced, over the roughly 2,000 years of their civilizational continuity, a body of literary and religious composition that, when read carefully, describes a world in which the boundary between what a modern reader would call gods and what they would call people is not sharp. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts are not exactly gods in the Greek or Christian sense. They are described as beings who came from somewhere else, who established themselves in specific places on the Mesopotamian plain, who conducted specific projects, the digging of canals, the founding of cities, the education of the first human kings, and who are associated with specific technologies. The chief among them, in the earliest layers of the material, are Anu, the Sky Father who remained, mostly in the heavens, Enlil, whose city was Nippur and who is described as the executive authority on earth, and Enki, whose city was Eridu, who is described as the master of the deep waters, the patron of craftsmen and engineers, and the surveyor and mapper of the world. Enki's Sumerian epithets are extensive. He is called the Lord of the Deep, the Lord of Wisdom, the Lord of the Reed, the Fashioner of Forms. He is the god who, in the Atrahasis epic, warns the human protagonist to build a boat before the Great Flood. He is the god who, in the Enuma Elish, sires the hero Marduk, and in the Enki and the World Order composition, he is the god who travels across the known world after the flood, restoring the divisions of the earth and marking the places where each function of civilization is to be housed. The Enki and the World Order text runs to approximately 460 lines in its most complete surviving version. It is preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 BCE to 1600 BCE, though the composition itself is believed to be older, going back perhaps to the middle of the 3rd millennium. The text opens with a hymnic praise of Enki, describing his primeval origins, his residence in the deep waters, and his role as the organizer of civilization. It then moves through a sequence of regional visitations. Enki travels first to Suma proper, then to what the text calls the highland countries, then to Meluha, the Indus Valley, then eastward beyond it, and finally back to the west. In each place, he performs specific ritual actions, establishes specific institutions, and marks specific locations. The Eastern Lands passage is the shortest of these episodes and the most geographically ambiguous. It is also the passage on which Sitchin built his correspondence with the Chinese sites. The passage, in the standard scholarly translation, describes Enki proceeding beyond Meluha into what the text calls the Black-Headed Lands, a phrase that in other Sumerian contexts refers to the Sumerians themselves, but that here refers to a further eastern population. He's described establishing 5 markers. The Sumerian term for these markers is difficult to translate precisely. It has been rendered variously as boundary stones, hidden places, sealed treasuries, or foundational deposits. The action Enki performs at each marker involves what the text describes as descending, hiding, and establishing. The verbs are consistent with descriptions elsewhere in the corpus of Enki placing sacred objects underground or beneath water. What is not consistent, what makes the Eastern Lands passage distinctive, is the geographical specificity. The text names features at each of the 5 places. It names elevations. It names the character of the local landscape. It describes the presence of running water at 3 of the 5 sites and its absence at 2. And it describes, at the 4th site, a mountain that is to be sealed by a later ruler, and that will remain sealed until an age the text does not specify. The correspondence Sitchin proposed reads this passage as a literal itinerary. The first marker, at a high elevation with abundant running water beneath, corresponds to Baigong on the Tibetan plateau. The second, described as a chamber below the surface, with water gathering into it, corresponds to Longyu in Zhejiang. The third, described as a place of the female powers among low hills, corresponds to New Heliang in Liaoning. The fourth, described as the mountain to be sealed by a later ruler, corresponds to Mount Li in Shaanxi. The fifth, described as a marker of the heights in a plain, corresponds to the Xianyang Pyramid complex, also in Shaanxi. Each correspondence involves a specific match between the Sumerian description and the actual physical or archaeological features of the Chinese site. Some of the matches are more forced than others. The strongest correspondence, and the one that has generated the most attention, within the alternative research community, is the fourth. The description of a mountain to be sealed by a later ruler, in a text that predates Qin Shi Huang by more than 1,000 years, is difficult to explain as coincidence. Either the Sumerian text is a general description that happened to fit a specific later event, or the Sumerian text is describing something that was already in place when Qin Shi Huang built on it. Sitchin's own interpretation developed at length in the Lost Realms was that the 4th site had been marked by Enki, with the specific instruction that it would be sealed by a human ruler at a later date, that the emperor's action, in other words, was not the origin of the sealing but the fulfillment of a much older instruction. This is a large claim. It requires taking the Sumerian text as a literal record of a divine visitation. It requires accepting that the Sumerians were describing events that had actually happened in specific places involving specific figures. Sitchin was consistent about this. His entire body of work rested on the proposition that ancient religious texts should be read the way ancient historical texts are read, as documents whose authors were describing what they understood to be real events. He acknowledged that this reading was in tension with the mainstream approach to ancient religion. He argued that the tension was worth accepting because it produced more specific, testable claims than the mainstream reading did. And it did. The specific claims are the reason we're still discussing this text nearly a century after the first modern translations of it appeared. The Chinese sites themselves have geological and archaeological histories worth summarizing at greater length. The Baigong Pipes are located in a formation known locally as Mount Baigong, a low sandstone peak on the northern shore of Lake Tuson, at approximately 37 degrees north latitude and 97 degrees east longitude. The pipes were first brought to serious scientific attention when the Chinese physicist Yang Ji of the Beijing Institute of Geology led a team to the site in 2002. The team collected samples from multiple pipe formations, both those exposed on the cliff face and those found in situ underground. The chemical analyses were published in 2003. Yang's team confirmed the iron content, confirmed the anomalous age of the surrounding sandstone matrix, and offered as their preferred explanation the fossilized root hypothesis, while noting that certain features of the pipes did not fit that hypothesis well. Subsequent work by other Chinese researchers has argued more strongly for a non-organic origin. The debate has not been settled. The pipes remain in place. Tourists visit. The site has been developed with modest interpretive signage that acknowledges the debate without resolving it. The Longyu caves have been studied more intensively. The Chinese Academy of Sciences, working with the Zhejiang Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics, conducted a systematic survey of the caves beginning in the mid-1990s. The survey established the dimensions of the 24 chambers, mapped the passages, and analysed the chisel marks on the walls. The chisel marks were found to be remarkably consistent, a series of parallel diagonal grooves cut into the sandstone at regular intervals, at what appears to be a consistent angle of approximately 60 degrees from vertical. The consistency of the marks across the 24 chambers, cut by what would have to be many different workers over years or decades of construction, has been described by Chinese engineers as remarkable. The pillars supporting the cave ceilings are hewn in a distinctive teardrop cross-section. The largest single chamber has a floor area exceeding 2,000 square meters and a ceiling height of approximately 30 meters. The volume of stone removed from the total complex has been estimated at close to 1 million cubic meters, a quantity of material that, if quarried in the conventional way over the standard estimated construction period, would have required the labour of tens of thousands of workers, and yet no historical record documents such a project. The absence is the anomaly. Chinese state archaeology has advanced no fewer than 7 alternative theories for the cave's purpose: grain storage, imperial residence, military garrison, mausoleum, quarry, refuge, ritual site, without settling on any of them. The Nuheliang site was excavated systematically by the Chinese archaeologist Guo Dashun beginning in 1983. Guo's team documented the goddess temple in 1984, unearthing fragments of a life-size clay figure of a female deity with inset jade eyes. The figure was found in situ in a subterranean chamber, oriented on a specific astronomical axis. Further excavation revealed a series of stone-lined ceremonial platforms and cairns spread across an area of approximately 50 square kilometers, indicating a substantial ritual landscape rather than a single sanctuary. The dating of the site has been progressively refined through radiocarbon analysis. The main ritual complex has been dated between approximately 3500 BCE and 3000 BCE, placing it firmly within the Hongshan cultural period. The specific combination of features at Nuheliang, the goddess imagery, the underground chamber, the astronomical orientation, the jade craftsmanship, the extensive landscape design, has no clear parallel elsewhere in East Asian Neolithic archaeology. It is unique. The Chinese Institute of Archaeology has recognized it as one of the most significant sites in Chinese prehistory. It is, however, less known internationally than sites of comparable age in the Near East or in Europe. The Hongshan people had no writing. They left no chronicle of their beliefs. What was worshipped at Nuheliang, and by whom, and for what reason the goddess was placed in an underground chamber with jade eyes, can only be inferred from the physical remains. The Mount Li Mausoleum is the most extensively documented of the 5 sites and simultaneously the least accessible. Sima Qian's account in the records of the Grand Historian, completed in approximately 91 BCE, is the longest ancient description of the tomb. Sima Qian was not a first-hand witness. He wrote more than a century after the tomb was sealed, but his sources included official Qin records that had by his time been substantially preserved through the Han Dynasty archives. He described the tomb's construction, its interior features, and its ceiling in considerable detail. The pit of the terracotta warriors, discovered by farmers digging a well in 1974, sits approximately 1.5 kilometers east of the central mound. It is one of a series of associated pits containing thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, chariots, and officials, all interred to guard the emperor in the afterlife. The pit of the terracotta warriors has been excavated. The central mound has not. The mound itself covers approximately 56 square kilometers if the full mausoleum complex is included, and approximately 2.5 square kilometers if only the primary tumulus is counted. It rises to 76 meters above the surrounding plain, the equivalent of a 25-story building. The mercury readings from the mound soil sampling suggest a mercury lake or mercury river system inside the tomb of substantial volume. Estimates based on the surface concentrations put the total mercury inside the tomb at possibly 100 tons or more. This is a very large quantity of mercury. Its extraction and transport in the 2nd century BCE would have required a supply chain of considerable sophistication. The mines that produced the mercury have been tentatively identified in what is now Chongqing Municipality, some 700 kilometers to the southwest. The logistics of the operation are astonishing. What the mercury is doing in narrative term, flowing in the shape of a landscape mimicking the great rivers of the empire, is even more so. The Xianyang Pyramid complex extends across a broad area north of the Wei River, encompassing the burial mounds of the Han Dynasty emperors and their consorts, along with earlier and possibly older mounds whose attribution is uncertain. The Maoling, tomb of Emperor Wu, was constructed between 139 BCE and 87 BCE. The Yangling, tomb of Emperor Jing, was constructed slightly earlier. These mounds are securely dated, and their emperors are known. The mounds that raise the Sitchin question are the ones that predate the Han Dynasty and possibly the Qin, a category the Chinese archaeological literature acknowledges but has not fully mapped. Foreign researchers, historically, have had limited access to survey these older mounds systematically. The American writer Hartwig Hausdorff visited the region in the 1990s and produced photographs and estimates of pyramid heights, publishing his findings in a book called Die Weiße Pyramid in 1994. His work was not peer-reviewed, and his height estimates have been disputed. The general point, however, that there are large earthen pyramidal structures in the Xianyang region whose builders and dates are not fully established, is not disputed. The mounds are there. Anyone can see them from a train window on the line between Xi'an and Xianyang. Qin Shi Huang himself is a figure whose biography rewards attention in this context. He was born in the state of Qin, one of the 7 warring states that competed for supremacy across the Chinese landmass in the final centuries before the imperial unification. His father, King Zhuangxiang, ruled Qin briefly and died when the future emperor was 13 years old. The boy who would become the first emperor took the throne as king of Qin at that age in the year 246 BCE, and ruled Qin as a regional king for 25 years before the wars of unification concluded and he assumed the imperial title. He was a serious student of statecraft. He surrounded himself with legalist advisors, most notably the philosopher Han Fei and the chancellor Li Si, and he applied their doctrines to the reorganization of the state with a thoroughness that was unprecedented in the ancient world. He standardized the script so that documents written in one region of the empire could be read in another. He standardized the axle length of carts so that the ruts they made in the imperial roads would be interoperable. He standardized weights and measures, coinage, and legal procedure. He divided the empire into 36 commanderies, each with its own military and civil administration answering directly to the throne. And beginning in the year of his accession as king of Qin, when he was still a boy of 13, he ordered the construction of his own mausoleum at Mount Li, employing what Sima Qian records as 700,000 workers over the following 37 years. The scale of the project deserves emphasis. 700,000 workers over 37 years is a labour force comparable to the largest construction projects of the ancient world. The pyramids at Giza, by comparison, are estimated by modern Egyptologists to have employed perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 workers at peak. The Qin mausoleum was, by workforce, an order of magnitude larger. The workers were drawn from the empire's convict population, from conscripted labourers, and from prisoners of war. They lived in barracks at the site. Many of them died at the site. Sima records that the artisans who knew the tomb's interior arrangements were sealed inside the tomb when it was closed, an act that, if literally accurate, would represent one of the largest single instances of state-organised mass murder in ancient history. Whether Sima account of this final sealing is literally accurate is uncertain. Human remains have not been systematically excavated from the mound. The mound has not been excavated at all. What can be said is that the level of secrecy surrounding the tomb's interior arrangements was, by ancient standards, extraordinary. Qin Shi Huang did not want anyone to know what was in his tomb, and 2,200 years later, no one does. The emperor's death itself, in 210 BCE, occurred during an imperial tour of the eastern provinces. He was 50 years old by the traditional Chinese counting and 49 by the modern Western reckoning. The sources describe him as increasingly obsessed in the final years of his life with the search for immortality. He dispatched multiple expeditions to the eastern seas in search of the mythical islands of the immortals, the same eastern seas that the Sumerian Eastern Lands passage seems to have envisaged. He consumed elixirs prepared by his court alchemists, elixirs whose known ingredients included mercury. It is possible, though not certain, that Qin Shi Huang died of mercury poisoning induced by his own alchemists. The mercury in his tomb, in this reading, may not be only a landscape model, it may reflect a broader association of mercury with immortality that shaped the emperor's own end. What is certain is that his death was concealed by his advisors for a period of some weeks, so that the succession could be managed, and that his body was carried back to the capital in a covered carriage accompanied by carts of rotting fish to disguise the smell of decomposition. It is a strange story. It is also, in its main details, well documented. Sima account has been checked against other contemporary sources and generally holds up. Sima himself is a figure worth pausing over. He lived from approximately 145 BCE to approximately 86 BCE, serving as court historian to the Han Emperor Wu. His records of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, is the foundational work of Chinese historical writing. It covers the period from the legendary Yellow Emperor down to Sima Qian's own time in 130 chapters totaling more than 500,000 characters. Sima Qian was not a naive historian. He is famous, in Chinese historiographical tradition, for the rigour with which he checked his sources and for the fact that he underwent castration rather than commit suicide in order to complete the work of history he had begun. His account of Qin Shi Huang was written approximately 100 years after the emperor's death. He had access to imperial archives, including surviving Qin dynasty records, and he interviewed elderly witnesses whose grandparents had lived under the Qin. His description of the mausoleum in the 6th chapter of the Shiji includes specific engineering details that were long assumed to be embellishment. The Mercury rivers were the most famous of these details. When the modern soil surveys confirmed the Mercury, they retroactively increased the credibility of the rest of Sima Qian's description. If the Mercury is real, the ceiling inlays might be real. If those are real, the crossbow traps might be real. The full contents of the tomb remain to be discovered. Whether they will be discovered in this century is uncertain. To place the Sumerian claim about Enki's eastern journey in its full context requires understanding who Enki was in the Sumerian religious and cosmological system. He was not, in the earliest layers of the Sumerian material, the supreme deity. That position belonged to Anu, the Sky Father, who resided in the heavens and delegated the executive functions of the pantheon to a small number of subordinate figures. The chief executive figure on Earth was Enlil, whose city was Nippur, and whose particular domain was what the Sumerians called the Middle Air, the atmospheric space between Earth and sky. Enlil is presented in the texts as the figure who issues the decrees. He is stern, he is sometimes cruel. In the Atrahasis composition, he is the deity who resolves to destroy humanity through the Great Flood, and who is only thwarted when Enki warns the human protagonist to build a boat. Enki, in that story and in others, is Enlil's brother, or in some genealogies his half-brother, and is consistently presented as the more sympathetic of the two toward humanity. His city was Eridu, which the Sumerian tradition regarded as the oldest city in the world. Archaeologically, Eridu is one of the earliest attested urban settlements on the Mesopotamian plain, with continuous occupation going back to at least the 6th millennium BCE. The city's central temple, the Abzu, was dedicated to Enki throughout the city's history. The name Enki in Sumerian is composed of two elements. En means lord, Ki means earth or land. Enki is literally the lord of the earth. His alternative name in later Akkadian sources is Ea, meaning house of water. The dual naming reflects Enki's dual domain. He was the god of the earth, and he was the god of the fresh underground waters, the aquifers, the springs, the subterranean rivers. In Sumerian cosmology, the fresh underground waters were called the Abzu, and they were understood as a physical realm beneath the earth's surface, from which Enki drew his authority, and in which he was said to reside when he was not conducting business on the surface world. The Abzu was, in the Sumerian imagination, both a physical location, accessible in principle through wells and springs, and a mythological one, a realm of primordial waters that predated the creation of the visible world. Enki's association with fresh water made him the patron deity of irrigation, of well digging, and by extension of all activities requiring engineering knowledge. He was the god of the reed, the material from which the Sumerians built their houses, their boats, and their writing styluses. He was the god of the craftsman. He was the god of the surveyor. And when the Sumerian texts describe him travelling out from his city of Eridu to organize the wider world, the activities they attribute to him are consistently activities of measurement, mapping, and installation. The compositional structure of the Enki and the World Order text mirrors this concern with organized geography. The text opens with a hymnic passage praising Enki's origins and his residence in the deep waters. It moves to a passage describing his relationship with the other major deities of the pantheon. It then presents a sequence of episodes in which Enki visits specific regions and establishes specific institutions. Suma proper receives its share of divine attention. The text specifies that Enki establishes the barley and the sheep, the arts of weaving and metallurgy, the basic domestic technologies of Mesopotamian civilization. Meluha, which mainstream scholarship identifies with the Indus Valley, receives its share. The text specifies that Enki establishes the black wood, the carnelian, the lapis lazuli, the tin, the trade goods that Sumerian merchants would later import from the Indus. And then the text moves into the Eastern Lands passage, which is briefer and more geographically ambiguous, and which describes the 5 markers whose correspondence Sitchin proposed with the Chinese sites. What is striking, in the fuller context of the Sumerian corpus, is that Enki is precisely the figure who would be expected to conduct such a survey. He is the surveyor deity. He is the marker of boundaries. He is the founder of underground installations. If any figure in the Mesopotamian pantheon were to be assigned the task of mapping the eastern lands and establishing hidden markers there, it would be Enki. The internal consistency of the Sumerian material, at this level, is high. The question is whether the material describes real activities in real locations, or whether it is a purely symbolic composition whose surface geography is metaphorical. The Hongshan culture, whose ritual centre at New Heliang forms the third of the Chinese correspondence sites, is worth exploring at greater length as well. The culture is named after a hill in Chifeng, Inner Mongolia, where its distinctive red-painted pottery was first identified by Japanese archaeologists in the 1930s. Subsequent excavation has established that the Hongshan people occupied a broad region spanning northeastern China, southeastern Mongolia, and portions of the Korean peninsula, from approximately 4,700 BCE to approximately 2,900 BCE. Their material culture is remarkable in several respects. They produce some of the earliest jade artifacts in world history, including the distinctive pig dragon carvings, whose iconography would later be absorbed into mainstream Chinese cultural symbolism. They constructed elaborate ceremonial landscapes involving underground chambers, above-ground platforms, and astronomical alignments. And they buried their dead with grave goods of a sophistication that implies significant social stratification, meaning a ruling class that could command craftsmen and labourers on a scale substantially beyond what conventional models of Neolithic Chinese society had allowed for. The New Heliang complex itself, occupying an area of approximately 50 square kilometres in what is now Western Liaoning Province, represents the most sophisticated single Hongshan site yet excavated. Its principal features include the Goddess Temple, discovered in 1983, a subterranean structure oriented along a precise north-south axis and containing fragments of at least one life-sized female figure. The figure's eyes were fashioned from jade. The face had been modelled with attention to individual features. The ceremonial platforms surrounding the temple, laid out in a specific geometric arrangement across the landscape, indicate that the site was designed as an integrated ritual complex rather than as a single sanctuary. Guo Dashun, the lead excavator, has published extensively on the site in Chinese-language academic venues, and his findings have been summarized in English by scholars including Sarah Nelson of the University of Denver. What Nelson and others have noted is that Nuheliang has no clear parallel in East Asian archaeology. It appears without precedent. It sits, in the standard Chinese archaeological narrative, awkwardly ahead of its expected developmental sequence, a level of ritual sophistication that conventional models place 1,000 or 2,000 years later. The Hongshan jade tradition is worth its own note. The pig dragon figures in particular are distinctive. They are compact carvings, typically from a few centimetres to 15 centimetres in length, representing a curled creature that combines features of a pig and a dragon in a way that resembles no living animal. Their function is uncertain. They have been found in high-status burials, often placed on the chest of the deceased. The most complete examples are held in the collections of the Liaoning Provincial Museum in Shenyang, the Palace Museum in Beijing, and a small number of foreign museums, including the Freer Gallery in Washington. The precision of the carving, achieved with stone tools on a material harder than most metals, is one of the enduring puzzles of Neolithic technology in East Asia. The jade itself, in most cases, comes from sources in what is now Zhuyan County in Liaoning, which the Hongshan people would have had to reach through overland travel and organized supply networks. The connection between the Hongshan jade tradition and the later mainstream Chinese jade tradition of the Shang and Zhou dynasties is now established. The pig dragon iconography persisted, in modified form, through the succeeding cultures of northeastern China, and eventually merged with the emerging Chinese state cultural repertoire in the 2nd millennium BCE. What this means is that the Hongshan culture was not a dead end. It was one of the roots of what would become classical Chinese civilization. The implications for the standard chronology of Chinese state formation are still being worked out by Chinese archaeologists. The implications for a possible Sumerian correspondence, if any, have not been worked out at all, because no one in either field is doing that work. The pattern of 5 and the specific arrangement of the sites across the Chinese landmass is worth noting on its own. The 5 sites span, roughly, the 4 cardinal directions from a central point near modern Qian. Baigong is to the west, high on the Tibetan plateau. Longyu is to the east, in coastal Zhejiang. Nuheliang is to the northeast, in Liaoning. Mount Li and Xianyang are central, in Shaanxi. This kind of geographic arrangement, 5 markers laid out with reference to a central point, is characteristic of ancient sacred geographies from many parts of the world. The Chinese themselves organized their own state cosmology on a 5-directional model with a central point and 4 cardinal directions, from at least the Zhou dynasty forward. The Sumerians organized theirs similarly. Whether the correspondence is coincidence or something more, the pattern is not arbitrary. The Sumerian material has parallels in other ancient corpuses that describe divine figures surveying or marking the world. The most striking is the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya of highland Guatemala, which was transcribed in the 16th century by Spanish missionaries from the oral tradition of the Quiche priests. The Popol Vuh describes, in its opening sections, a group of creator figures, the makers, the modelers, whom the text names Tepeo and Gukumats, who survey the world before humans exist. They walk over the earth. They establish the mountains. They set the boundaries of the seas. They mark specific places for specific purposes. The parallel with the Sumerian Enki and the world order composition is not a matter of shared vocabulary or shared narrative episodes. The 2 texts come from cultures separated by half the world and by thousands of years of independent development. It is rather a parallel of structure. In both texts, a divine or semi-divine figure engaged in mapping and marking activity precedes the establishment of the human civilization that inherits the marked landscape. In both texts, the markers are specific to place. In both texts, the marking activity is described in terms that a modern reader would associate with engineering or surveying rather than with pure religious action. The Popol Vuh names specific locations in the Guatemalan highlands where the makers performed specific actions. The mountain of Hakawitz, the mountain of Pauwelix, the plain of Chiasmachi. These are real places, still identifiable on modern maps, still associated with Qichi's ceremonial practice. The correspondence at that level is close to what Sitchin proposed for the Chinese sites in the Sumerian material. And the response of academic Mayanism to the Popol Vuh has been substantially different from the response of academic Sumerology to the Enki text. The Popol Vuh is treated as a serious source. Its geographical references are checked. Its correspondences with archaeological sites are studied. The Mayanist Dennis Tedlock, whose translation and commentary on the Popol Vuh appeared in 1985, has been widely cited and generally respected. There is no equivalent scholarly treatment of the Enki and the World Order text's Eastern Lands passage. The two texts occupy different scholarly categories, not because their contents are fundamentally different, but because the fields that received them made different choices about how to read them. A secondary parallel is available in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas, composed in an early form of Sanskrit and preserved orally in the Brahmin priestly tradition of India for a period estimated at 3,000 years before it was committed to writing. The Rig Veda contains hymns to a figure called Vishvakarma, the divine architect, whose name means literally the maker of all. Vishvakarma is described as measuring out the earth, laying down the foundations of the world, and establishing the sacred geography that the Vedic ritual system would later inhabit. The correspondence with Enki as surveyor is not accidental in the sense of trivial similarity. It reflects a common ancient conceptual category, a category of divine or semi-divine figures whose function is understood as engineering rather than as pure metaphysical creation. In the Vedic material, Vishvakarma is one figure among many. In the Sumerian material, Enki is one figure among many. Both traditions describe the initial mapping and organization of the world in terms that would, in modern language, be called technological. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa provides a third and less remarked parallel. In the Ifa divination corpus, the primary religious text of the Yoruba, the figure of Obatala is described as the sculptor of the human form and the surveyor of the world, sent down from the sky by the supreme deity Olodumare to establish the boundaries of the inhabited earth. The Ifa material has been preserved orally through the Babalawo divination priesthood, with only partial written transcription undertaken in the 20th century. The Nigerian scholar Wande Abimbola, a former vice-chancellor of Obafemi Awolowo University and one of the leading modern authorities on the Ifa tradition, has produced translations and analyses that are respected within religious studies circles. The Obatala survey narrative is not framed as literal history within Yoruba religious understanding, but neither technically is the Enki narrative within its own tradition. The pattern of the surveying divine figure, engaged in specific place-marking activity, recurs across 3 continents and 3 unrelated linguistic families. It is not, of course, proof of anything specific about the Chinese sites. It is, however, a pattern that suggests the ancient world took the idea of divine or semi-divine engineering more seriously than modern academia typically does. The Hopi creation tradition, preserved by the Hopi people of the American Southwest through oral transmission and partial documentation in the 20th century, contains its own account of the marking of the world before human occupation. Frank Waters, in his 1963 Book of the Hopi, transcribed material from Hopi elders describing the emergence of the current world and the placement of markers by ancestral beings. The book is not without its critics. Some Hopi elders have disputed the completeness or accuracy of Waters' transcription. But the general shape of the Hopi tradition, as documented by multiple ethnographers over the 20th century, includes the same pattern: a mapping activity by non-human or partly human figures, preceding the establishment of human occupation, involving specific geographic markers whose locations are still identifiable. None of these parallels prove that the Enki and the world order composition is literal history, nor do they prove that the 5 Chinese sites Sitchin identified were marked by a Sumerian god. What they establish is that the interpretive category Sitchin was working in, the category of ancient texts describing divine engineering of specific geographic locations, is a real category present in multiple independent ancient traditions and worth taking seriously as an object of study. The category has not been taken seriously as an object of study. It has been assigned, in the mainstream academic worldview, to the domain of religion and myth, and treated as symbolic rather than descriptive. That treatment is a choice. It is not the only possible choice, and the choice becomes harder to defend as the physical evidence at specific sites, the Baigong metallurgy, the Longyu geometry, the New Heliang jade dating, the Mount Li Mercury, the Xianyang mounds, accumulates without an alternative explanation. The strongest counter-argument to Sitchin's Chinese correspondence, the one that must be taken seriously, is the argument from translation. Sitchin's readings of specific Sumerian passages have been criticized on philological grounds by scholars including Michael Heiser, whose work on the 12th planet argument has already been mentioned. Heiser's critique was rigorous within its scope. The concern is that Sitchin, working from the mid-20th century translations of Kramer, Jacobson and their contemporaries, sometimes extended the semantic range of specific Sumerian terms beyond what the philological evidence supports. The word Sitchin, translated as landing platform, for example, has been argued by other Sumerologists to mean simply an elevated ritual platform without any implication of aircraft or spacecraft. Similarly, the words Sitchin translated as boundary markers in the Eastern Lands passage have been argued to mean simply cairns or ceremonial stone piles, without the more elaborate implication of engineered installations. These are legitimate philological concerns. They are not, however, decisive. The reason they are not decisive is that Sumerian is a language with a limited surviving corpus, no living speakers, and a lexicon that is still being extended by ongoing scholarship. The exact meaning of specific technical terms in the Sumerian corpus is often uncertain. Reasonable philologists can disagree. Sitchin's readings were, in some cases, at the aggressive end of the possible range. They were not, in most cases, outside that range. And the specific question of the Eastern Lands passage has not been the subject of any focused philological engagement by his critics. The critique of Sitchin has been general rather than specific. It has addressed the 12th planet argument and the Sumerian astronomy claims. It has not addressed the Chinese correspondence directly. The other significant counter-argument is that the correspondence between the Sumerian text and the Chinese sites could be produced by any moderately motivated reader working with a sufficiently ambiguous text and a sufficiently anomalous set of archaeological sites. The Sumerian text is short. Its Eastern Lands passage is briefer still. The Chinese landscape contains dozens of anomalous sites. Selecting 5 of them and matching them to 5 ambiguous descriptions is not, on this argument, evidence of a real ancient connection. It is evidence of pattern matching by a motivated researcher. This objection has some force. It applies, however, less strongly to the 4th site than to the others. The description of a mountain to be sealed by a later ruler in a Sumerian text composed more than 1,000 years before Qin Shi Huang's birth is specific enough that its match with the emperor's actions at Mount Li is difficult to dismiss as accident. Either the correspondence is real, or the Sumerian text is more polyvalent than its critics acknowledge, or Qin Shi Huang was in some way responding to a tradition that had reached his court through channels that historians have not documented. Each of these possibilities is worth examining. None of them has been examined in a peer-reviewed venue that specifically addresses the Eastern Lands passage. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. It remains unresolved not because it has been resolved and the resolution is unfavourable to Sitchin, but because it has not been engaged. What it would mean, if the correspondence Sitchin proposed is substantially correct, is not that the mainstream account of Chinese civilization is wrong in most respects. It would mean, more narrowly, that certain specific sites on the Chinese landmass have origins that predate the conventional narrative of Chinese state formation, and that these origins are documented in a Sumerian text that has been available in translation for the better part of a century. It would mean that the Sumerian corpus, and specifically the Enki and the world order composition, contains geographical information that could not have been available to its authors by any conventional means. It would mean that the boundary between religious text and historical record in the ancient Near East is less sharp than modern scholarship has treated it. It would mean, above all, that the sealing of the tomb at Mount Li by Qin Shi Huang was not the beginning of a mystery but the closing of one, and that what is beneath the mound has been beneath it for a much longer time than the emperor's 2,200 years. The tomb at Mount Li remains sealed. The Baigong pipes remain in the sandstone. The Longyu caves remain empty. The goddess temple at New Heliang remains under the earth. The pyramid mounds at Xianyang remain untouched by systematic foreign archaeology. The Well Blundell prism remains at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, listing the antediluvian kings and their combined reigns of 241,200 years. The Enki and the World Order tablets remain in the Mesopotamian collections of the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania, and Berlin. The translation by Jakobsen and its successors is available through the University of Oxford's electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature to any researcher who wants to read it. The Lost Realms by Zechariah Sitchin, published in 1990, is still in print. What Enki was doing in the Eastern lands, according to a text that has been sitting in translation since before most of the researchers who might now examine it were born, is a question that has never been formally taken up by either Sinology or Sumerology. It is still open. The tomb was sealed in 210 BCE. It is still sealed. What the emperor knew, and what he was preserving, and what the Sumerian text a millennium before him had already described, that is still open too. It has been open since the tablets were first read. It is still open now.